Hello, everyone, and welcome to Café New Canadians, a virtual talk show brought to you by New Canadians TV network. Today on Café New Canadians, we will be talking about understanding Canadian workplace culture and tell you all about how you can succeed in a diverse environment. My name is Shruti Dargan. I will be moderating this chat, and joining me will be four guests who will talk all about Canadian workplace culture, share their insights and tips and advice for you so that you can excel in the workplaces. We have with us Ingrid Sikorcin. She's a workplace communication instructor. We also have Nichola Williams, an HR manager, diversity, equity, and inclusion advocate, also has a background in project management. We have with us Patrick Mwesigye. He's the founder and program manager for Hope for Refugees International, and Dargan, who is a software quality analyst. All four of them, as I said earlier, will be sharing lots of tips and advice for you. And without further ado, I'd love to welcome them so that they can start sharing their experiences with us. But with a quick reminder that this session, we will also be taking your questions. So all of those people joining us here on Zoom can type your questions in the Q&A tab. If you're joining us on YouTube, you can use the chat box option and share your questions, and we'll bring them up between the session. So very warm welcome to our guests. We're happy to have you here with us. Let's get started with a round of introductions. Nada, starting with you, would you like to very briefly introduce yourself to our guests? Tell us a little about yourself, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nada Khan, and I work in Canada in the IT industry. I work as a software quality analyst for a firm known as Sabermetrics. So as someone who arrived in Canada less than 2 years ago, I am very excited to extend not only my warm wishes, but my tips and advice to newcomers here. I'd love to share snippets of my journey, of the mistakes I made along the way, the lessons I learned from them. And I hope I can help newcomers to the best of my ability to help them navigate, everyday life in Canada.
We're quite certain of that. Thank you for joining us. Ingrid, how about you go next?
Yes, good evening. Thank you so much. My name is Ingrid Sikorcin, and I am a workplace communication instructor at the Mennonite New Life Center in their bridging programs, as well as at Toronto Metropolitan University's Workplace Communication in Canada program. I started my teaching career in South Korea, where I taught for 10 years in their English as a foreign language programs in their universities. And then when I returned back to Canada, I transitioned to workplace communication. It's a very rewarding for personal reasons. My mom also immigrated to Canada and went through the same struggles, the same challenges as newcomers do here. So there's a little bit of that personal connection. And of course, anything I can do to support newcomers in their journeys. I'm very excited to do that and hope to do it to the best of my ability.
We're so excited to have you join us. Nichola, how about you?
Sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. My name is Nichola Williams. I'm an HR manager at the Canadian Centre for Women Empowerment. It's based in Ottawa. It's a nonprofit dedicated to addressing economic abuse and economic injustice. Our work focuses on economic abuse prevention and response through meaningful community engagement. And I wanted to be here just to be able to assist anyone who's going through what I went through as a new immigrant. Sometimes, it's not always easy, the transition. Now, I've been here for quite some time, and I've changed fields like multiple times. And I think I'm finally in a position where I feel like, I can make an impact and help others to navigate the hurdles that I myself have navigated in the past and still do as an immigrant, sorry.
Pleased you could join us. And it's all about, the spirit of Café New Canadians. What we do at New Canadians is also just giving back as immigrants to other newcomers moving to the country. Patrick, last but not least, if you could share a little bit about yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Patrick Mwesigye, and I am roughly 2 years and 10 months old in Canada. And I work as the program manager for Hope for Refugees International and also the founder. And I also work as the newcomer program coordinator for Uplift Black Center for Social Justice, which is based in Barrie, but I live in Toronto. I've been working in the nonprofit sector for 11 years now, in various levels as a chief executive, as a program director for programs, communications. I've supported like different, departments within the nonprofit sector. I started my career in the nonprofit sector in around 2013, and I've had the pleasure to work on things like women's rights, sexual reproductive health rights, maternal and child health, refugee rights, gender-based violence, and gained lots of skills over time in, like writing programs, evaluating programs, resource mobilization, communication. And yeah, I'm here now, excited to start a new career in Canada. I'm also happy to see Ingrid on, as a panelist, because she was my instructor when I just come, when I just, I did a bridging program with Mennonite New Life Center, and she was one of our instructors teaching us, communication skills and all that. So it's really interesting to be with her on the same program. I'm happy to share my experience, working in Canada, what I've learned, the challenges I've faced, but also to give you hope that it's possible to shine here as a newcomer. It is because we come in with a lot of skills, a lot of experience, a lot of expertise, and often we get scared because of the different white faces and the systems and the accents. But for me, I can guarantee it's possible to make it through. So I'm really happy to share some of the insights and the skills and the tips that I've learned along the way. Thank you.
Thank you for saying that. What you said sets the tone perfectly for starting this conversation, which is all about learning and understanding the Canadian workplace. And I'll start with Ingrid. The title says Understanding Canadian Workplace. So help us understand the Canadian workplace. What is the culture like? If you could tell us a little bit about, some attributes or some specific characteristics of the Canadian workplace, in terms of, it could be how people function, if one should be direct or indirect, and especially keeping in mind that as immigrants, as newcomers, we come from different cultures, and the workplaces here could look very different from what we're used to. If you could now share
Sure.
something.
Well, in my course on the very first day, that's a question I ask participants, like, whether you've already worked in Canada for a little while, or you're just going based on your assumption, or things you've heard from family or friends, for example, what is it that you think a Canadian workplace looks like? And invariably, everybody already knows, right? So number one, that no two workplaces are exactly alike. So there is a lot of diversity even within Canada. Even, you work at one school or one nonprofit or one production company, can be very different, working in the same field. Just depends on who your colleagues are, who your managers are, the workplace culture. So there's that diversity. And so the most important soft skill, I think, for newcomers to have is adaptability. Being able to adapt to that specific workplace culture, which in general, yes, you're right, people are a little bit more indirect than in other cultures. The need to be explicit, right? Be clear, explicit, and concise, and asking a lot of questions is really, really important as a do. Another thing, put everything in writing. Right, is very important. And that's just an expression of being explicit. So first you might say it in a meeting, and then you'll follow up in writing as well. So these are the kind of little do's to be aware of. But ultimately, each workplace culture is a little different. And the key is to adapt, right? To adapt to what that particular workplace culture is like.
Thank you for sharing that. Now, Nada, if you could share, one of the first things that people know as immigrants moving when we're applying for jobs or when we get through to our first role is we know Canadians are polite. Besides that, what was it that you knew about Canadian workplaces?
So while we do know that Canadians are polite, there's also a lot of inclusivity, like including everybody basically, is something that is key in Canadian communication and during networking as well. And because of the factor of diversity that comes in, when one is networking in Canada, there's a there's a kind of, respectfulness that we should have for the diversity that exists. It's undeniable that, one may have like an unconscious bias towards this kind of diversity. So it's very important to be self-aware and respectful when you're dealing with situations of not only applying for jobs or, networking itself. And during networking, it's also very important to be open-ended in communication. I mean, it's a two-way lane, So every time you're networking, just keep the conversation open-ended.
Yeah, we'll come to networking later. But moving to Patrick, is there something you'd like to add to what Nara just shared in terms of your experience or stuff that you learned from Ingrid and were able to practice in your workplace among your workmates?
Yeah, thank you very much. So, for me, for starters, I'll say work is work.
Mm-hmm.
Regardless of where it happens, and much of work is done in a given workplace, and the the although the context might be different, but the concept is the same, because if it is arrive at work at 8:30 a.m., then it's 8:30 a.m. It could be Eastern Standard Time, Western Standard Time, East African time, whatever it is. So the Canadian workplace, for me, the context hasn't really been so much different, having previously worked more like in a formal work environment. But of course, there's a few things that I've observed and learned. One, I've learned that um, I think Canadians are very brief or precise. Um, you know, if it's like an email, it is very, very precise and brief. There's
Yeah.
like they don't have to share so much. And then also, I think they really, in any given workplace, they value communication, and they believe in a very open, but also very explicit communication. And I've also learned here that in any given workplace, you have to make sure that you know, like what you're supposed to do, and the people around you are very much willing to help, as opposed to some other places I've worked in. Like everyone is really interested in not only their success but everyone's success. So the whole thing about teamwork here is like a big deal, right? And I've also noticed that here in many Canadian given workplaces, they want to support you to grow. There's like effort. I've also seen, like, for some of the big organizations, they have like huge budgets for capacity development for staff.
Upskilling as well. Yes,
Yes,
if
and
you want to.
upskilling and all that. Yes, which, like, for example, in the context of like Africa and what there's not so much that is done to invest in like staff capacity development and growth. So I've
Yeah.
seen it. AI is a huge deal here, which I've also seen in many of the given workplaces, really wanting to make sure that there is representation across board, and whether it is from the context of gender, race and all that
As
kind
your
of.
co-panelist said, yes, there's a lot of diversity, inclusivity, and a lot of great points that all of you made. With that, Patrick, I'll come back to you in very briefly. But Nichola, I wanted to also learn from you, if there's something you wanted to add to what your co-panelists have shared. And also, you play the role of, you're in the HR space, you're one of the people who is most likely sharing guidelines when it comes to Canadian workplaces with the colleagues joining. So, from your experience and your perspective, what would be things that you can add, and also some things that you can share in terms of conducting oneself in a Canadian workplace, whether it's when you're sending out an email in meetings or in more virtual situation? It's a long question for you.
So I'd like to touch on, first of all, although we do have a polite and respectful environment workplace, I find that sometimes this can create a bit of ambiguity, right? Because you normally will have to ask follow-up questions. Don't be shy to ask follow-up questions, because that's how you get to understand, what's needed to be done, or the specific needs of the organization. And on a cultural note, I think Canadians often avoid confrontation. They will say something like, give you indirect feedback, like, you might want to consider doing this, or you might want to consider doing that. These are things that you need to pay attention to, because these are suggestions that are very important and will help you improve in whatever task you're doing. The other thing I've noticed is that, like, typically when you just join an organization, you want to know what the company policies are, for one. We always want to know what the norms are, how to operate. Like, we want to know what's the expectations, because and it's all about language, because sometimes we go into a workplace and we have to understand the etiquette in terms of, hey, can I speak my particular language with my friends while I'm working, or do I have to wait until lunchtime or break where it doesn't seem like I'm excluding my colleagues? So these are things that we take for granted, but can be seen as, you're not being inclusive, or you're not adapting. And it goes a long way to help you to adapt to the culture and be seen as a collaborator. So I'll leave it on that note.
And to the second part of my question, which is more about, are there any tips that you'd like to share? And I'll be moving to Ingrid right after, about conducting oneself when sending out emails, or, in person or virtual meeting.
I think it's one of the things I learned when I went into the workplace is really pay attention to what people are saying and how they conduct themselves, because then you can replicate that behavior, because it shows you whether you should speak up, whether you should wait and take it offline, because some topics you just can't have while there's a meeting. If you're too upset when you receive a message, or you're too upset, don't get emotional about it. We always say don't get emotional, but the truth is, half of the time, me myself, if I'm misreading something, I'll write it and leave it, walk away from it, come back to it, and revise it before I send it. And because I know my boss is extremely busy and she has limited time to deal with my emails, I try to make it as succinct as possible, get straight to the point, but not have an aggressive tone, because it can be misconstrued as, oh, this person's too direct. Yes, you need to have it direct, but just a little softer tone. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's great that, now there are so many tools like Grammarly, or there's AI
Grammarly.
support when it comes to, also being able to correct your tone and check, especially with emails, if it's sounding right. And that, I think, helps a lot of people when sending out those professional emails. Ingrid, a similar question for you. So you're someone who's coaching a lot of newcomers when they're preparing to enter the Canadian workplaces. When it comes to, again, emails or conducting oneself in virtual meetings, in-person settings, this could be networking, this could be a job interview. What would be some tips that you have, or learnings that you share with your students about the Canadian workplace, and how one can prepare for it?
Okay, so I would like to echo what Nichola mentioned. I completely agree in terms of asking questions, right? Being clear is very important, and not everyone's clear all the time. Maybe we think we are, we assume we are. It doesn't matter our fluency, our accent. There are times when perhaps we think we're being clear, but to the listener, we're not, right? So it's really important for people to take the initiative, right? Don't wait to be asked, don't make assumptions, ask questions. I think our managers would much more prefer that we ask questions instead of walking away wondering and then hoping somebody else can answer the question. I think sometimes people fear that they'll appear incompetent, right, if they ask questions, but I guarantee you, in most cases, managers will welcome that, right? Because it shows, that you care about your work, right? That you want to do a good job. You want to be clear as to what your tasks or responsibilities are. So I completely agree with that. Taking initiative is really important. And also what Nichola was mentioning about paying attention, right? I think communication in general is a problem-solving process. There's so much gray. And for us to navigate that, we have to observe. We have to ask questions, analyze, pay attention to what others are doing, what they're not doing. And I really like what you said in terms of self-awareness, right? And that's a big part of it. Emotional intelligence is a huge part of being effective communicators. So self-awareness and social awareness, and taking the time to do that, to ask yourself these kinds of questions before acting, right? So that, I think, like you said, there are a lot of tools now for us to write a perfect email, but it's what happens, I think, before that that's more important to some degree.
Thanks for sharing that. Now, Nada and Patrick, we were talking a little bit about virtual meetings as well. And Nada, you mentioned that we're working in a very culturally diverse environment. So, keeping those two things in mind, would you like to share an anecdote or your personal experience of from your workplace? How have you been able to establish relationships in a culturally diverse environment? And has virtual meetings or maybe a hybrid way of working been helpful or has been a challenge? Because especially that we're not able to kind of meet in person as often sometimes in those kind of team settings.
Yeah, I would say that being in a virtual environment compared to like an offline environment where you're seeing everyone in flesh and blood is a whole different experience when it comes to connecting in a diverse environment. I think when it is a virtual environment, everything is purely work. You meet for work, you talk for work, and there's very little window for you to actually socially interact with your fellow colleagues who may be from a different place or from a diverse culture. So I feel like, yes, the virtual environment is a bit of a bane when it comes to that. But when it comes to my experience, my workplace is completely virtual. So,
Mhm.
and, we're also a team built of people coming from different places and different cultures. However, I think I reiterate what I said before, just being respectful and being mindful of the diversity that exists has really helped me to be able to connect with each one, each and everyone who's present on my team. And I think it's also a lot of learning from experience and, touching back on what Nichola said about, kind of reading the room. So that's one of the key skills I think that one can have when you're in a diverse environment, reading the room and really reading what is exactly going on and how you can be aware of, socially aware of what is going on around you. These are the things that eventually play out in the long run when it comes to communicating in a diverse environment at work.
Certainly. Thanks for sharing that. Patrick, would you like to add something there?
Yeah. So, I will re-echo Nada's insights. I think it's important to, in any given workplace, especially if you want to build like relationships, to first and foremost know that it, it's most likely going to be a diverse kind of like working environment, and to really embrace and go in when you embrace and respect diversity and know that it's going to be different, maybe sometimes the way people are, and their cultures and all that.
Yes.
But from large and by, I think there's like a, a couple of things that you have to keep at the back of your mind as you build these relationships. So things like integrity, like Nichola said, things like being polite, being respectful, not only respecting others, but also respecting yourself. Because I'm a believer of, you cannot give what you have. If you're one person that doesn't respect yourself, it's going to be difficult for you to even respect people within your given workplace. Things like kindness, demonstrating kindness, empathy, um, and again, really understanding your given workplace. Like, it's really important to
Each workplace could be different. You're so right.
exactly, yeah. When you go in, know what your institution is about, what it does beyond just your job alone, like broadly, wide, what do you do? What are some of the policies? It might, it might not be part of your deliverables, but really having a broader understanding of what your institution is about, I think would be very important. And again, like Ingrid said, the whole idea of paying attention to details is also very important in building relationships, especially with like a supervisor. Those things, like Nichola said, um, your supervisor will just, politely speak to you and mention or hint on a few things. It's important that you go back and reflect on them and say, okay, how do I go about this? How do I improve this? Do I need to ask more questions? Do I, all sorts of
It's a
stuff.
continuous process of like working on yourself, understanding and reading the room. Now, I'd
Yeah.
like to build a little bit more on, the conversation that we've been having around being culturally diverse, because that's also where there could be an unconscious bias. There could be a misjudgment of what one is saying, and there could be conflict. So, conflict resolution in the Canadian workplace, in a culturally diverse environment, could be difficult to navigate. What are some of your tips there? Whoever would like to go first, from either your personal experience, if you've been in a situation that you would like to describe without taking names, or from something that you've learned as part of, Patrick or Ingrid, if you'd like to share from the course that you teach.
Yeah, I think from conflict, honestly, I really love what Nichola said earlier, and it's something that I've done and it has worked for me. Every time I'm angry over something, or like I'm boiling up, and maybe I need to communicate, I need to send an email, I need to, I just I kind of like first give myself a break to cool down, right? And then that helps me to like reflect, to come back to my senses, and then I'm able to communicate in a more polite, in a more respectful way. I think addressing conflict in any given work environment needs you to be calm, right? It needs you to also understand and say, okay, how could I have done this better? Yes, I know oftentimes we're pointing fingers the other side, which is okay. Oftentimes, because nobody wants to own any problem, right?
Yes.
We always want to pass it on to someone, but then just like, and for me, this is something that I've always like used. I'm like, okay, so if I find myself in this particular conflict, I'm like, what could I have done better, right? To
Yeah.
maybe ensure that it couldn't have happened or what. But if I know that, well, I've done everything within my space, oftentimes I will, like walk to my supervisor in a very respectful way and say, okay, I would like to us talk about this. And and sometimes I like even doing it formally, like dropping them an email, and I'm like, well, maybe on ABCD, I think um, I wasn't happy, or I'm concerned about A, B, C, and
So
D, and
expressing yourself is, yeah.
can we have a conversation over it? And before even going to other people, just like having an interaction with a person within whom I'm concerned about. Yeah, so it's
Certainly. I'd love to hear Nicola's views on this as well. I'll read out a comment from one of our attendees, Ramona Tsering, that they've met a few people, newcomers who've experienced overt racism, but they feel stuck, but they need the job, so they continue there. And the fear is of using their voice because there's no sense of power that one feels, and even if it's not a safe space. Now, from an HR perspective, Nichola, what tips would you have to navigate, situations involving unconscious bias? There could be subtle discrimination, and how can one do that while fostering a positive dialogue without creating havoc within the team, but being able to kind of just escalate the matter when it's needed?
I think the first thing is like, you have to speak up about it, but speak up politely. Don't react off of your emotions, because I've been there where, I felt singled out or excluded from a conversation. And just to give you an example, and this wasn't even at work, this was at the church that I go to, right? And they speak different languages. I only speak English. And I remember having a conversation with my pastor, and it was like somebody approached us and they started speaking in their own language. And I was like, in my mind, I was like, how rude, because I'm thinking, okay, I would be more considerate, and but also I'm thinking from an HR lens as well. So I simply said, hi, excuse me, 1 minute, please. And then I said, once they finished speaking, I pulled the person aside and I said, hi, you probably didn't even intend to do this, but when you did this, this is how it made me feel. Because sometimes it comes from not knowing how they're perceived. It may not even be intentional, as we say, it could be unconscious, right? And we misinterpret it because we've been exposed to so many situations where our voices aren't heard, or where no one allows us to be seen or even speak up. And so that's one thing. And again, document it. Look around, see what your policies are within the workforce, because every organization has policies around discrimination, about who to speak to if you're facing a situation where, you feel like you're dealing with this.
Yeah.
You can speak to your immediate supervisor, as I said, document everything and see what the progression scale is when it comes to dealing with these situations, because you want to make sure that, you're going with sort of the mindset that it's not intentional, because sometimes it's not intentional. I myself have, I tend to have this bias where I'll reach out to people who look and sound like me. And I've learned that I need to be intentional about the people who inhabit my space. And having a repetitive strain injury, which affects me, I've had to be like, hey, now I understand like what somebody who doesn't have this ability deals with. Now I've made space for other people now that I've dealt with it myself. And that's how we shift our mindset, So we also have to take that into consideration when we're dealing with situations like that. It's not always intentional.
Those are very great tips. Thank you for sharing those. Another theme that you have mentioned earlier is teamwork. We spoke a little bit about there is focus on teamwork in a Canadian workplace, while there's also self-advocacy that is highly expected, and you're supposed to be talking about yourself, about your achievements, while also expressing that there are team qualities and there's so much that the team has done together. This could be tricky to navigate as well, especially like say I moved from India, and it's a culture wherein you don't brag a lot about yourself. You don't talk about your achievements as much. It's more always team effort. Ingrid, I'd love to know from you, and then Nada, if you could share your own experiences of how you were able to experience or work this around in your workplace. But Ingrid, from you first, a little bit about how can one strike a balance between talking about team skills while also having that self advocacy out there.
Right. And that's really important, marketing yourself any chance you get. And it doesn't have to be necessarily at a networking event or with a recruiter or at an interview, right? I always tell people, take every and any opportunity to market yourself. It doesn't mean you're giving an elevator speech to everybody you meet, but you're letting them know, right? Who you are. There's that saying, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And a colleague of mine, adapted that a little bit to, it's not who you know, it's who knows you.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's really important just to kind of plant those seeds in people's minds as to what you're up to. And if I can give you just a very quick example from one of the participants in the bridging program, I gave them a challenge to market themselves through small talk. So she took it upon herself to do that. She's in the IT program. And it was a parent, of her daughter's friend at the school, and they just happened to meet each other on the street, talked about the weekend. She happened to mention that she was in this program and that she's working on this project, just very subtly, didn't go into depth. Anyways, long story short, it turns out that he is in the IT industry as well, this acquaintance. And she had no idea, right? And he ended up telling her, once you finish the program, let me know. I'll see if there are any positions open in my company. So again, that conversation never would have happened unless she had initiated it and kind of marketed herself that way. In terms of interviews, yeah, I think there's always an opportunity, even though you're talking about yourself as a good team member, that you collaborate well, you communicate well. In and of itself, that highlights your skills, right? Even though teamwork is the context. So I think you could do both at the same time.
Thank you. Nada, coming to you, if you'd like to share, how you've been able to kind of practice that in the workplace, any examples you'd like to share of when you were trying to kind of advance your career, what were some things that helped you and you can share as learning?
Right. So when it comes to teamwork, I usually view the term as synergy. For me, teamwork equals synergy. So synergy basically means that each and every member of the team has an individual contribution that eventually, as a collaboration, amounts to teamwork. So when I'm looking at teamwork, I am looking at individual contributions as well. So each time I've had to, market myself or market my team, I consider both the individual contributions of a team member that was present and also the way that they collaborated. So I think for me in my career so far, looking at it in this way has helped me, not only in my career in Canada, but also my past career in India. I always made sure that each time there was an instance where I had to talk about an achievement, I spoke about not only my own contribution, but also the collaboration that existed, also the individuality that every team member brought to our team. So I think a view of that kind is something that contributes to, not only promoting yourself, but also looking out for your team.
Patrick, now the same question, but I'd like to add another layer, which is of leadership. You're in a role in your organization wherein you're the founder, and you might be working with other people. And in a Canadian workplace, you're setting the tone for people around you in how you lead as well. If you'd like to share some tips on what would be key characteristics of a Canadian workplace when it comes to managing a team, leading a team, or working collaboratively with people.
Thank you. So I must say that, again, things are a little bit different here. Even having previously been a chief executive for like almost 8 years and coming here and starting an institution, although I'm not like the executive director of the institution, but I'm still in a decision-making position and kind of like managing a team. So first and foremost, I'm one person who 100% believes in teamwork, and that's something I've practiced over time because of working as a chief executive before for a very long time. Because it's unless you really build a strong team, then you won't push further and you won't like expand beyond some of the boundaries that ideally you would. So for me, for starters, it has been first and foremost appreciating the people that you work with and really taking that extra step to support them, to know how they are doing, like for example, I'll be honest with you, like if I have someone on my team and I know they have a family, a child, I would want to know their child, like maybe like their child's name. And tomorrow I'll be like, hey, hi, Nichola, maybe how is so and so, right? Maybe referring to the child. So even the mere fact that I can remember the name alone of their son or their daughter of, um, is I mean, it's not a big deal, but I'll be like, oh, you actually even still remember so and so's name, right? Just like something pretty simple. But also being clear in terms of how we work, clarity on roles, those regular meetings where you want to bring people together and you're part of your team and you have those, could be staff meetings, it could be regular check-ins with, either for the whole team or for specific people to make sure that, like all stuff is on point in terms of like tasks and, offering that support where there's need, and also very, very importantly, delegating work, to the team that you work with. Not because you have to, but also because you want to build capacity and also to show the team that you're working with that you trust them, right? Because otherwise it becomes like a one man or one woman kind of like show. But I just wanted to briefly hint on what you said earlier. And I think the culture in India is not different from Uganda. In Uganda, when you talk about yourself and what you've done and what you've achieved, they say, oh, you're boasting, you're blowing your own trumpet, all sorts of things. So, and this is something that I really struggled with when I'd come here. To be honest with you, I would even fear to talk about my achievements, talk about the many things I've done in my life career, because I felt like, oh my God, they're gonna say, oh, he's proud. He wants everyone to know about what he has done. Because that's a culture back home, and it's different here. Like I've seen here, people tell you what they have done, right? But I've learned now along the way to promote and market myself, right? Because I believe here that the culture is that people respect your work. They respect what you've done, and what you've done defines you. right? So it's really a very difficult balance to hit. But I mean, coming from like cultures where we've come from, but I think it's how you really politely present yourself and what you've done, and also acknowledge that you didn't do it alone, but you were part of a team. And that's the reality. I mean, like you cannot do it alone. It has to be it has to be people
Certainly.
from the list to the top. They all have a contribution. Yeah.
Now, moving on, there's something that I'd like to discuss next would be building strong workplace relationships. Someone mentioned earlier about, Canadians could be slow to also build trust. In a new team, when you join, you're talking about your achievements, previous achievements, you're working, there's teamwork involved, but those relationships take time to build. And there's also trust that needs to be gained within your colleagues, within your lead, with your managers, maybe. Some tips that would help newcomers who are applying for jobs to know those things in advance and probably work on those in their personal lives right now and then practice them in their professional lives. Nada, would you like to share something?
Yes, I think one of the key things that I would target in a situation like that is, dropping hesitation. Now, with the background that I come from, um, in the workplace, hierarchy plays an important role, wherein when you're talking to someone who's at a different hierarchy, there's a lot of factors that come in, and there might be a little bit of hesitation. Whereas in the Canadian workplace, communication is open and direct. So I would suggest newcomers to take full advantage of that, drop the hesitation and make sure that A, all your concerns are addressed if you have any, and B, build a rapport with everybody around you. I mean, that's where the trust begins, right? Once you have a rapport that's building around with people around you, that is when they really start relying on you. And apart from that, of course, your work speaks for you, but having a positive tone of communication with everybody, having an open-ended, conversation with people around you, having an open door policy that, you're approachable in case anything comes up. I think those are key in building relationships in the workplace here.
Ingrid, I'd love for you to go next and share a little bit about, certain qualities that would help people build those leadership skills, build workplace ethic that eventually helps in gaining trust and showing one's personality and one's ethic at the workplace as well.
So I think for one, stepping out of your comfort zone is important. So like Nada said, not hesitating, initiating conversation, even small talk. I know in the programs that I've taught in that's a big one. People aren't comfortable making small talk, building rapport, because it's just not used to it and they don't know what to say or how much to ask, etc. But just even showing interest in others is big. And that involves active listening. And the core of active listening is putting the focus on the other person, right? Asking them follow-up questions, exactly what Patrick mentioned, right? Remembering what somebody has said and referring to it at some point. It doesn't have to be exact. You don't have to have a great memory to do that. But these little kind of efforts, right, to go a long way in building rapport, which then builds trust. So I've noticed that people struggle because they want to share, themselves, right, what they're about, to market themselves a little bit, but they need to balance that with also showing interest in others, right? Focusing on them, asking follow-up questions, and then building on that, whether it's they're in the workplace or outside the workplace.
I can see that a lot of what all of you have been sharing is resonating with the audience. I see lots of comments of people saying thank you and good points made by the panelists. So I'd like to thank you on their behalf that you're helping them with lots of tips. Nichola, would you like to add something to this conversation around building trust, but also adding some do's and don'ts? Something that comes to mind from what Patrick was sharing earlier about building connections, building relationships. It's good to learn a little bit about our colleagues' personal lives. But that also brings me to a point about not asking too many personal questions either in the workplace. So could you weigh in a little on that, please?
I think one of the things is taking the time, of course, as Patrick said, to understand your colleagues' cultural backgrounds. I mean, their communication preferences. That really helps. I remember one thing that I told the interns that work with us. They'll be like, oh, we don't know how to connect with the people that we with when we're in meetings. And I'm like, okay. And when you're sitting in a meeting, are you taking notes? Try to come up with, because I remember somebody had told me that. It's another thing before I even go to that level, you have to make sure that you have a good mentor. And mentors are really important because they help to teach you the norms. They help to, they bring you along in network. They introduce you to the people that you should know. They teach you the ins and outs, how to maneuver, how to sort of go around situations. And that's really important. When you go into a work environment, always have a mentor who understands the work environment, who's been there for a while. But most people don't really speak about a sponsor. And you need a sponsor who somebody who's at top level, who's been there, who knows, who those people are to connect you, who can speak about your work, who's going to inhabit that space when you're not there to speak about you and elevate you as well. And going back to what I said earlier, um, it's understanding cultural backgrounds. And I remember telling the intern, again, take notes, ask questions. If there's a topic of conversation about something that's happening, make a note of it so that you can follow up with the person. But don't let it be you're just doing that just to curry favor. It's something that you must really be interested in and say, hey, you are having a discussion about maybe they're implementing software and you're curious about it. You ask them, hey, what brought about this change? Why did you want to do this? Like, what is this project about? Because you're really interested and they can see your passion and they can see your interest. So they'll take time to have the conversation with you. And there, you're building rapport with them without being, pretentious. And it's a real connection. And just following up on that. We have LinkedIn, which is an amazing tool. Sometimes you just reach out to somebody and you say, hey, I noticed you went to this school and I'm curious. I've had people reach out to me. I remember when I was at corporate, one young man reached out to me and he's like, how do I get into this field? I see that you were a project manager at construction. Like, how did you do that? And I remember telling him, you know what? It was through my connections that I got that role. And then when I went there, these are the things. And I asked follow-up questions to find out exactly like where he wants to go with it, why, what's his passion behind it. And then I give him tips pertaining to his question, right? So we also have to look at, there's so many different aspects that you have to look at.
Thank you for sharing that. And something that you said has really stuck with me about, having a sponsor. I've heard of networking and mentorship and having a mentor, but having a sponsor is something that is new to me in terms of someone who can be an advocate for you and elevate you. That's a great tip right there. Now, I feel a conversation around understanding the Canadian workplace would be incomplete if without talking about feedback giving and receiving as well. And that's one of the last things that I want to maybe discuss very briefly. Starting with you, Ingrid, what would be, say, 2 tips that you can share, or a strategy that you can share about giving feedback and receiving feedback? Do a note maybe that you want to share?
So I think that the most important thing when it comes to first of all, you should ask for feedback, right? Again, taking initiative, not waiting for the biannual or annual review. Taking the initiative to, especially when you first start a position, asking for feedback shows, again, that you care about your work. It's important to you to do a good job. As Nichola mentioned earlier, people can be very indirect when giving feedback. Canada kind of falls in the middle on that scale.
I think it's called a sandwich approach.
Yes, so that's how it would be expressed, right? Being kind of in the middle of that direct and indirect. And that can be very frustrating for people who come from very direct cultures. Because they have to figure out exactly what it is that they need to do to improve. So my suggestion would be to be very specific about your question, right? Don't say, how is this or how did I do? Ask about, what can I do to improve my organization of this document, or how can I better present this next time, considering the audience. So be very, very specific, because then the more specific your question, the more specific the feedback. Otherwise, people just give kind of vague, oh yeah, that was good. Maybe you can try a little bit of this or that. And then it's up to you to figure out what exactly they mean. Ask follow-up questions if you're not clear about what they mean. That's really important. Don't walk away from the conversation. Also be aware that it's not easy to give feedback, right? It can be difficult for somebody because they don't want to hurt your feelings or they don't want to create any rift in the rapport that you have with them. So also being aware of that. And in terms of giving feedback, yes, people tend to use the sandwich method. But again, being as specific and clear as possible, as well as encouraging, I think is important.
Thank you for sharing that. Patrick, is there something very briefly that you could add in terms of your own experience with giving or sharing feedback?
Well, feedback. What I would like to say is giving feedback, like Ingrid has said, might sound like something that is easy to do, but oftentimes you are not even sure because you don't know how, especially if it's like a supervisor, you're not even sure how they're going to take it, right? So that's why it's important when feedback comes to just take it positively because sometimes the people that have very genuine feedback for us might even fear to give it to us, and if we are not open to feedback, it is very difficult for us to grow. But I think as a newcomer and in any given workplace in this country, you need to be open to feedback and take it positively. It doesn't matter whether it's good or bad. I'm one person, honestly, who's open to feedback. However hurtful it is, I take it and I go and think about it. And I'm like, okay, how do I improve? How do I make myself better? It's good to look at feedback from the context of bettering and improving yourself, right? And building a relationship with whoever that you are working with. Yeah. And these
Nada?
tools that we can utilize to also get feedback. For example, if you are leading on a certain project within your given workplace, right? And you can send out an evaluation form. You can use SurveyMonkey, you can use Google Forms, you can like and just keep it pretty simple. And yeah, so
Sometimes also keep it anonymous. Uh,
very
yeah.
important.
Nada, your experience with what is known as constructive criticism in the workplace?
So I think when it comes to feedback, I always pair it with constructive because I mean the whole point of it is that it should be constructive. When it comes to both giving and receiving feedback, I like to take it as constructively as possible.
Mhm.
And I would mention an instance where there was a time when I was supposed to give feedback to my boss. And so that was a particularly challenging situation because, there could be a lot of different factors involved and there couldn't be a lot of comfort in that conversation. And so what I did is that luckily, like Patrick mentioned, was that, there are different tools nowadays, which are, a digital, online, or written feedback, which is honestly, I think a lot more constructive and a lot more to the point because it really strikes out what you want to convey. So I took the opportunity by using the sandwich method itself, which is something that I've learned. And I not only coupled my feedback with something positive, but I was also exact in the sense that what I would be expecting out of, the issue that we had, or that are exact ways that we could counter the issues that we're having. And luckily, it went across very well, and my boss really appreciated it. They like that I took a stand when it came to some issues. So I think there's a constructive way to do everything possible at the workplace. That just has to be done in a way that it eventually leads to action, I think.
And it all comes in place with preparation and practice.
Absolutely, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. Nichola, your last thoughts on this conversation around giving and receiving feedback?
I'll speak more on receiving feedback because, I mean, everybody's touched on the sandwich method,
Mhm.
which we're taught, right? And I think it's we also have to think about, as Patrick said, listen. We also have to have a growth mindset about it. We have to acknowledge that feedback, show appreciation, because even if it's challenging to hear, because like we never like to hear that we haven't done our best. It's always hard to swallow that pill. But thank the person, say, you know what, thank you for sharing this. But not only just that, avoid any overreacting because in that moment you might become defensive, right? Self-reflect on the feedback that you've gotten. Like start thinking about it and determine like, what aspects are really, valid, what are actionable. Like sometimes you hear something over and over. So seek those patterns, and really think about, okay, how can I action some of these things? How can I change them? Set goals for yourself and be like, hey, this feedback, I did this with this feedback. Reach out to the person who give you those feedback and say, thank you for this. It has been inspirational because I've been able to do this based on what you've said to me. And this is something we never do, you know.
Mhm.
So I think it's really important to follow up. I find when I do give feedback, like some of the people that I work with, they'll reach back out and be like, hey, you're right. Like for one instance, I had somebody that was working under me, and it was something that I learned at corporate. So I checked in with the person. I did one-on-one check-ins, and I said, "Hey, so how are you doing? Is there anything I can assist you with?" And they were telling me about an issue that they were having. And so I asked if I can give a suggestion. And they're like, "Sure, I'm open to suggestions." And the one thing I told them is that within the Canadian workforce, when your boss is extremely busy and you have an issue, sometimes before you go to them with the issue, think of a solution. What solution can you put into place? Because they'll be more receptive and open to listen to you if you can also come up with a solution so that they don't have to think about it. Because remember, when you're in leadership, you have so many different things that you have to think about, so many different people that you're working with. So sometimes just also think of a solution of how you can counteract that. And then whoever you're speaking to, they'll be more open and more receptive to hear what's going on. And it'll be, they'll streamline the process to help you more.
Thank you. I see more comments about this being a great panel. Thank you to all of you for sharing these insights. With this, I think I only have time left for one quick round of any last tips that you have to share. We've spoken about building relationships, about seeking feedback, about building trust. We also talked a little bit about understanding Canadian workplace, some tools that you can use. Now, any last tips? I'll start with Nada. It could be a line of motivation you have, or just to summarize what you said earlier, but very briefly in about 30 seconds.
Yes, just to summarize, my main tip to newcomers would be to be confident in their approach, to always believe in themselves. It's definitely not the easiest thing to come to a new country with a diverse background, but be confident and trust your gut. That'll get you everywhere.
That's a great tip. Thank you. Patrick, what would you like to add in terms of it could be a do or don't, a mistake that you would like to warn people against?
For me, my last patch would be building connections and networks. I think I work with very many newcomers who are struggling to find work,
Mm-hmm.
even in a country which has lots of work opportunities. Some spend as long as a year, 2 years, 1.5, and they have literally found nothing. And then you ask them, have you volunteered anywhere? They're like, no. Which people do you know beyond the fellow newcomers that maybe you live within the shelter, or a few people who are within your network of your country, and and they tell you, ABC and D, and out of all the people they have said they know, there is nobody who is in position even to refer them somewhere or refer them to a great opportunity. So for me, I think
Building that network.
need to create time and build networks. Go out for events, show up, register for events. It could be an employment fair, it could be just a meeting, sign up for newsletters and to be able to directly get information, show up and be present and talk about yourself. Because I believe in this country, it's very important to know people. It's very important to
Yes.
have mentors who can support your work. And also importantly, I think it's good to know that in this country, people focus more on the skills that you have than even the qualifications that you have. So really being able
Yes.
to demonstrate those skills and know people, and also LinkedIn. And I want to thank Ingrid because when I was doing
I'm so
that.
sorry to interrupt, Patrick. With very little time, I'd quickly want to just ask Ingrid and Nichola for a quick tip as well. Ingrid.
Yeah, just very quick, because people have been mentioning in the chat that they may be, or they know somebody who's the target of discriminatory practices. And if it's coming from management, they may not have the support they need, or there's no HR department, for example. There are community organizations that you can reach out to that will support you and guide you through a process. So please reach out to those, look them up on Google, reach out to immigrant organizations, and they have that information that can assist you.
Thank you so much. Nichola, maybe 15 seconds, one last tip.
I was just going to say, learn about employment standards in the workplace, minimum wage, breaks, vacation time, there's so many that you need to learn. And that's where you start, health and safety regulations. You need to understand what the policies are within the workplace, and that'll be your guide to navigate these instances.
Thank you so much. With that, we're calling it a wrap on this session. And thank you for your time also to the attendees. This was Café New Canadians, which was brought to you by New Canadians TV Network. We have lots of information across our platforms, which include a TV show for those in Canada. We have a YouTube channel, a website with lots of resources, and also a newsletter and social media platforms. And we would encourage you to like, follow, and check out all of our platforms for lots more content and more sessions of Café New Canadians. Thank you so much to everyone who joined today. Have a good one.